Missouri has 427 registered sex offenders per 100,000 Missourians. That gives Missouri the sixth highest number of registered sex offenders per capita in the country.
Some parents are concerned after a federal judge relaxed a state law that kept sex offenders away from children on Halloween. WGEM's Missouri Capitol Bureau reporter Hannah Falcon has reaction.
Registered sex offenders used to be required to put up a sign like this one, saying no candy or treats at this residence on Halloween. But a federal judge recently ruled in favor of a man who filed a lawsuit against that law, so these signs will not be required this year. On a holiday where children are encouraged to take candy from strangers, Missouri has some extra laws in place for sex offenders. Under Missouri law, they have to turn off all their lights after 5 p.m. They cannot put up Halloween decorations, and they cannot participate at any Halloween events with children. But a federal judge dismissed one law that required them to post signs deterring trick-or-treaters. The judge ruled the law violates the free speech rights of those on the sex offender registry.
You never know who might be watching for an opportunity to be able to connect with families with young, vulnerable children.
Tara Bishop runs a Facebook page called Child Predators Exposed. She's disappointed in the ruling, saying it prioritizes the rights of convicted sex offenders over children and victims.
I don't feel like someone that has been convicted of those types of crimes should have those same rights as the rest of us when it comes to warning the public about that behavior.
However, the Association for Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse says the risk toward children trick-or-treating is lower than portrayed, as 93% of sexual abuse is committed by a person the child knows.
Kind of the reverse. Instead of the constitutional right of free speech, it is the free speech of you're making me make a statement, and you can't do that.
Former county prosecutor Bill Tackett tells me the legal argument in this case is tricky. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of a Hazelwood man convicted of sodomy 2 years before the sign law went into effect. He was under the impression he did not have to follow the rule because he was convicted before it went into place, and continued to host Halloween parties and put out decorations, according to the lawsuit. He was arrested in 2022 when police saw he was not complying with the sign law. His lawyers argue the signs make sex offenders a target on Halloween.
Okay, so they're going to have to weigh the potential harm to a trick-or-treater versus the freedom of speech not to make a statement.
The Missouri Attorney General's office filed a notice of appeal in this lawsuit. He tells me, I want Missouri to be the safest state in the nation for children. That includes on Halloween. Reporting in Jefferson City, I'm Hannah Falcon, WGEM News.